at this point in time, I'd probably been doing First Amendment litigation for 10 years. I was all pumped up going, you know, I could talk about the First Amendment. I could have some fun with that. And then he says, 9th, 10th, and 11th Amendments. And I go, oh, I don't know anything about the 9th, 10th, and 11th Amendments. People are paying more attention to them now. But let me tell you, I had to scramble to get ready for that presentation. And by God's grace, I didn't have to scramble quite so hard this time around. But anyway, the reason why these amendments have some importance is that they're really fundamental to the whole concept of federalism. And what we're trying to do is to understand the basic relationship between the national government, the state governments, and the individual. And these amendments really address themselves to that question. And if you remember a number of weeks ago, David Barton referenced a guy who had compiled a book that had some information from a study done at the University of Houston about where parts of the Declaration and the Constitution and so on came from, and tried to track it down, figured out that 34% of the concepts and the terminology used in the founding documents actually originated in the Bible, could be traced back to the Bible. Well, as part of that same book, I went looking for some discussion, and when we talk about issues of sovereignty, the author, Mr. Lutz, says that popular sovereignty is really based on several pretty key principles. First of all, that the American people are capable of distinguishing good if they have sufficient time and information. And secondly, because most of us have other parts of our lives that take priority over some of that stuff, then the people who are actually making the decisions must include those who have time and information, who have demonstrated they are virtuous, and who thus can assist the people in their deliberations. And then the last is the idea that the people who are capable of discerning good are inclined to choose that. So if we look at those assumptions that Professor Lutz talks about, what he's really saying is that ultimately it all traces back to people who select people that have time and information or some sort of expertise, who are virtuous, and that everybody will choose to do what's best for society. Okay? And what's really critical as we look at these three amendments is the whole concept that it's not just about understanding policy, but it's about character and virtue and using that for the public good. Okay? And again, if you look at stuff that dates back to that period of time, you can see that this whole concept of public virtue, as Lutz refers to there, it wasn't just a matter of picking the smartest person to be a leader. It wasn't picking the person that you necessarily just agreed with, but that they had a clear concept of liberty and virtue. That was part of it. Now, the amendments obviously came along after the Federalist Papers, because the Federalist Papers related to ratification of the Constitution. But if you look in there, you can see it reinforces what Lutz is talking about, that republicanism is based on delegation of the government to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. And then in Federalist 39, talking about a republic, it derives all of its powers directly or indirectly from the great body of the people. Okay? So the Ninth Amendment is based on the concept that ultimately all power is traced back to the people, who not only have the desire but the capability to choose what's best. Okay? So, here's the question. Since the Ninth Amendment talks about this concept of retained rights of the people, does the Bill of Rights cover all the retained rights? Or are there others running around out there? What do you think about that, just as a general proposition?
There are more.
Okay. So what are those other retained rights? If they're not listed in the Bill of Rights, where do they come from?
That great body of the people,
Okay. Stephen?
Legislation, of course.
Doug said they came from FDR's Bill of Rights later on.
Oh. Retained but hadn't been discovered yet. Well, we're going to delve into this a little bit, but again, if the idea is that the federal government is a government of limited power, and it really only has the rights that it's given, and anything that's not given to it or retained, we have to kind of figure out, so what have the people hung on to? And how do we figure out what those rights are? We'll come back and talk about this a little bit more, but if you think about the Declaration of Independence, unalienable rights included life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? So what does it mean if we're for life and that's an unalienable right? How far do you go with that? Okay? Or liberty, I just cited one example there. Do you have the right to work and earn a living without having to join a labor union? Okay, so we'll come back and talk about that a little bit later. Here's the text of the Ninth Amendment, which basically says, just because we talk about certain rights in the Constitution, that doesn't mean that there aren't others retained by the people. Now, what was the big battle between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists when it comes to rights? Anybody know that? Well, basically what happened was Hamilton and others were concerned that if we set out a Bill of Rights, everybody will think that's the exclusive list. So there's no more rights besides what we... And Madison is going, no. We're listing the ones that are really important, but that doesn't mean there aren't others. So you'll be shocked to know that there was a certain amount of political compromise here. Madison tossed in the Ninth Amendment to try and address the concern that Hamilton had.
So that Ninth Amendment was to say that there are other rights, just because we listed these doesn't mean this is exclusive.
Right. And so, of course, the $1 million question is, what are retained rights? And so, the material that I looked at suggested that the rights that people understood, that were retained by the people, were already pretty well understood. They were already documented in not only the English common law, but in the American common law that had been developed up to that point. And it didn't really contemplate that 9 wise souls, or 535 wise souls, or 1 wise soul would sit there and stroke their chin for a while and say, you know, the more I think about it, there ought to be a right of fill in the blank. Okay? So that's what the Ninth Amendment is really trying to get at. Well, similarly, if we go to the 10th Amendment, it's kind of similar, but it says any powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Now, that's kind of clear as mud, isn't it? Okay, if we don't give it to the federal government, we either give it to the states or the people. Well, that's a recognition, really, that at this point in time, under the Constitution as it was contemplated, the states were going to be a big deal. They already were a big deal, and the federal government was intended just to pull everybody together with enough glue to hold everything together,